My name is Elena Cross, and if you're listening, know this: storms don't begin with thunder. They begin with silence. A silence so sharp it cuts deeper than screams. That silence lived inside me for years, buried beneath grief and rage. My brother's blood was left on the cracked pavement of a city street, washed into gutters by rain no one cared to notice. They called it an accident. A robbery gone wrong. A tragedy that would fade like all the others. But I knew better. He was killed because he stood in the way of a man who never heard the word no. That man was Victor Kalin. Victor wasn't a gangster with dirt under his nails. He was worse. He wore suits tailored from other people's lives. He shook hands that signed nations away. He was the kind of man who could smile in the faces of grieving mothers, then turn and toast to their misery with vintage champagne. His empire was built on contracts written in blood. And when he wanted someone erased, the world obliged him without question. That was how my brother died. That was how silence was forced into me. But silence does not mean surrender. It is a mask. A weapon. I let them think I had broken, that Elena Cross had dissolved into grief and poverty, just another forgotten face. But while they ignored me, I learned. I worked in shadows, cataloging, gathering, piecing together the truth they buried so deep no one dared to touch it. I found the files. The transactions. The photographs no court would admit but that carved themselves into my memory like scars. Each discovery fed me like oxygen, building me into something harder, sharper. Something Kalin could not imagine, because men like him never see women like me coming. I became an archivist in government basements where files went to die. It was the perfect disguise. To everyone else, I was just another civil servant lost in dust and ink. But in that dust, I found gold. Documents that whispered of arms deals across borders, of politicians on Kalin's payroll, of bodies buried beneath boardrooms and banknotes. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became: Victor wasn't simply powerful. He was untouchable. Too many people owed him. Too many people feared him. If I tried to expose him through courts or newspapers, they'd bury me with my brother. So I didn't plan justice. I planned vengeance. For years I built identities like other people built houses. Forged passports. Ghost bank accounts. Skills and languages I pretended not to know. I became no one and everyone. Until the day the message came. It was simple. An encrypted text on a burner phone I hadn't used in months. No name, no explanation. Just 3 words and a location. The auction of sins. I had heard of it in whispers, a gathering spoken of like legend, where the world's most powerful sold not objects, but people, secrets, entire futures. Weapons outlawed by treaties, information that could topple governments, favors that would enslave entire nations. It was the marketplace where morality did not exist. And the rumor was that Victor Kalin wasn't just a guest. He was its architect. That was my stage. That was where I would bleed him. I spent weeks preparing. Disappearing. Erasing Elena Cross and becoming someone else entirely. Seraphine. A name whispered like smoke in underworld corridors, stitched from half-truths and manufactured rumors. To the world I built, Seraphine was dangerous, wealthy, untouchable. To me, she was armor. On the night of the auction, I stood before a mirror in a rented penthouse. My reflection was a stranger. Black silk clung like a shadow. A slit at the thigh made every step a blade. Around my neck, a diamond necklace no one would suspect carried a micro-listening device I'd built from scavenged parts. My eyes were rimmed in coal dark enough to turn them into voids. I had painted myself into something fierce, elegant, merciless. A predator among predators. Convoys lined the streets below, armored cars with tinted glass, engines purring like beasts waiting to strike. I walked into them without hesitation. Nobody questioned me. That is the rule of power: if you act like you belong, people bend the world to make it true. The auction was held underground, in tunnels carved during wars the city had long forgotten. The ceilings dripped with condensation. Walls lit by chandeliers stolen from palaces glowed with cold fire. Velvet curtains framed a stage where sin itself would be sold. The air reeked of perfume and corruption. I counted masks. Silver, gold, bone. Symbols of predators disguised as patrons. I recognized senators who had passed laws starving children, businessmen who bought entire governments, warlords who killed for sport. And in the center, Victor Kalin. His mask was a lion's grin, arrogant, cruel. He moved as though the ground itself owed him its loyalty. Laughter followed him like a shadow. My pulse thudded, but I let the fear fuel me. I wasn't prey. Not anymore. I slipped into the crowd, my mask hiding a storm. And when the auctioneer's voice rose, smooth as poison, the night began. Objects of horror paraded across the stage. Women disguised as luxury. Weapons banned by every treaty. Relics stolen from dead civilizations. But none of it mattered to me. I was waiting. Waiting for the final lot. The one whispered about in fragments. A ledger. A book not of ink, but of crimes. Every deal. Every name. Every empire Kalen had built on broken bones. I knew that ledger was mine. I had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times in the kind of silence that speaks louder than a shout, mapping every exit, every camera angle, every guard shift, but nothing sharpens the mind like being elbow-deep in a hall full of men who think their masks make them immortal. The auction moved like theater, each lot a scene meant to dazzle and distract, and I learned to read faces the way others read script. The flicker of greed, the instant betrayal of a conscience forgotten, the micro-shift when a man recognizes risk where once he saw only profit. I watched them bid and parry and crown themselves with things the world would never see, and beneath each detached motion I heard the little heartbeat of human cowardice that makes empires wobble. My allies were ghosts with names I whispered into secure lines. A coder named Malik who lived at 3 in the morning and fed off the hum of servers. A former investigator called June who could find a paper trail behind a stone wall, a woman named Rosa whose soul had been stomped by Kalen's factories and who carried a file of victims like a rosary. They were not glamorous. They were the kind of courage that shows up tired and hungry and does the work anyway. I paid them not in money but in a promise: truth will be the currency we trade until the system can no longer buy silence. At the auction, while velvet-cloaked bidders debated the price of darkness, I fed signals to Malik under the table, small pings that rerouted live feeds, that quietly copied the encrypted lot information to a drop he controlled. He worked like a phantom, fingers whispering commands across the city's veins, and I felt the hum of that connection like a second heartbeat. The plan had layers. First, secure the ledger. Second, create plausible deniability so the blame could not be traced back to us. Third, make the world watch when the ledger made the rounds. Simplicity is for children. Revenge is an architecture. When the final lot was wheeled onto the stage, the room inhaled as if expecting a miracle. The ledger arrived in a glass case, heavy with old leather and the smell of paper that carries memory. The auctioneer spoke of provenance and rarity and the historical value of secrets, but I saw it for what it was: a map of sins. Men leaned forward like predators smelling blood. Kalen smiled, an immediate predator smile, certain that the book would seal his immortality or at least by the right hands to bury it. He had built a web of influence so carefully that he believed even his failures were shields. I moved then with the calm of someone who has rehearsed disaster until it becomes choreography. I raised a bid. A number that made eyes turn. I matched challenge after challenge because if the ledger fell into anyone else's hands it would be used to carve their own piece of power. The number climbed. It was ridiculous. It was theatrical. I let them think I was a madwoman or a very rich collector. That is another lesson: power underestimates the eyes that look hungry enough to pay for truth. When the gavel fell and the loudspeaker announced Seraphine as the winner, the room breathed and applauded and did not yet know the currency had been reversed. Securing the ledger physically was only the beginning. I had hidden a duplicate, an electronic twin Malik carried out on a drive disguised as jewelry. The paper could be drowned in 1,000 lawsuits, the copy could not. But a ledger is more than names and numbers. It is nuance. It is context. The way one signature folded into another could reveal entire patterns. My nights in the archive taught me that. So I worked the room as a hunter folds into the hunt. I smiled at magnates pretending to be casual, I laughed into earrings with senators who would later choke on their words. And I winked at cameramen who would become unwitting couriers of ruin. Then the first fracture came. A man at the back stand, a director who had always been careful, received a message on his phone and his hand went white. He looked up and his eyes found Kalen, yes, and for a moment the two men shared something like dread. That was the point. The ledger had to make men look at their hands and wonder what they had signed in the dark. Rumors are useful, but nothing breaks an empire like the slow realization that the very contracts you thought hid you now expose you. After the auction closed, the circle of buyers dissolved into slow-moving streams of motorcades. I was supposed to vanish into the night as a buyer would. Instead, I drove a different route and watched the ripple I had sent. Malik unlocked a public channel at a scheduled time, and small pieces of the ledger leaked to a dozen underground forums and then to journalists who had either refused money or been pushed out of mainstream outlets. The trick is to be patient and hungry enough to let the drop feel organic. Too much noise and the world turns away. Too little, and it becomes a whisper again. We calibrated it like a fine instrument. The city reacted like a body with a new fever. Investors called. Markets twitched. Columns that once smiled at Kalen now asked questions that sounded like knives. He tried his usual things: lawyers' denials, staged interviews. His PR machine stepped in like an industrial mop to clean the water, but PR does not change numbers, and when regulators in 2 countries asked for paper trails, the mop looked embarrassingly small. The ledger's tendrils reached into places money had never wanted to be seen. It revealed yachts bought with blood money, bribes disguised as charitable projects, construction contracts where safety had been traded for speed. Each revelation was a pebble that widened into tidal motions. They hit back, predictably, nastily. Threats were anonymous and precise, a quality I had expected. Rose's mother received a package with pictures meant to frighten. June was cut off from his family by a legal freeze. Malik's apartment was searched by men in suits who left with files and a warning. This is the cost of flicking a system accustomed to buying its way out of trouble. It is the ragged part of the ledger you cannot erase by signature. I felt each attack like a knife, not because I was physically harmed as yet, but because collateral damage remembers faces and names. The world I was building had a price, and at times the ledger looked like a bill I could not pay. There was a moment, one that felt like the thin edge of a blade, when I considered whether the path I had chosen was simply a larger version of the cruelty I was fighting. To bring down a monster, you sometimes become monstrous in your methods. I slept poorly, and I dreamed of my brother's laughing face and the man who took him raising a glass in a room full of masks. I asked myself if destruction without rebuilding was worth the ruin. But then I remembered the mothers who had been paid hush money, the workers whose safety reports had been stamped cost-effective, the children who would never grow up because a bridge was built on shortcuts. Those faces no longer ask if the method is clean. They only ask for results. So we escalated, but with a plan to minimize wounds. We released a dossier to an international consortium of journalists who had legal protections and a will to publish together. We coordinated leaks across time zones to make it harder to smother. We targeted not only Kalen but his web, the bankers who made his transfers possible, the auditors who looked away, the charities that provided cover. Each name dropped into the public domain like a flare. The light was blinding. The predators flinched. They began to fight among themselves. Suspicion is a more effective weapon than steel when you can make a room think it is the only honest face. And in the middle of that chaos, the ledger revealed something worse than I had expected. Buried in the margins was a column of transfers that did not connect to known companies but to a seemingly innocuous foundation operating in another continent. That foundation's trustees included names I recognized as philanthropists, men whose faces smiled at cameras while their hands moved money to avoid scrutiny. This was deeper than I had thought. The auction was only a tentacle. The body that fed it reached into territories my small network could not touch alone. The revelation forced a pivot. If the auction was a market, the market had suppliers, and suppliers had suppliers. We adjusted. June found auditors in that other continent willing to open files. Malik scrambled servers to trace the flow. Rosa gathered testimony from families who had been touched by the Foundation's projects and who had later watched their loved ones die in factories built under fast-track contracts. The story swelled until it was too loud to ignore. When the first parliamentary committee began to ask questions in public about donations and contracts and the Foundation's links to shell companies, the room where silent bargains had been made began to leak like a sieve. But the deeper we dug, the more dangerous the predators became. They no longer merely threatened, they moved to destroy reputations, to erase allies, to burn possibilities. Someone set fire to a building housing records we had hoped to preserve. Phones went dark. A trusted source vanished, and we found only a note burnished with a message meant to terrify. It is in these nights when the ledger seems to weigh heaviest, and you must decide whether to keep moving or bury what you can and save your people. I chose to keep moving because if I stopped, the silence would return and it would be lethal. I knew the last act would demand more than patience. Silence had been my shield, but silence no longer fit the battlefield. To finish, I had to make noise so loud it cracked the walls of the world Kalen had built. I had to stop whispering and roar. The opportunity came not in a courtroom or a board meeting, but in a broadcast studio. A journalist we had fed pieces of the ledger to offered me the chair. Off the record, anonymous, voice masked, they promised. But I was past masks. Masks are for men who profit in shadows. I had carried the name Seraphine long enough. Now the world would hear Elena Cross. The night before the broadcast, I sat with the ledger spread across the table, the book open like a wound. My brother's name was not written inside, but every page was carved from the silence of his absence. The ink glared at me like an accusation. If I stopped here, Kalen might weather the storm. If I pushed further, there would be no way back. I thought of my brother's laugh, the way he used to tell me to play louder, to not let the world shut me down. That night I did not sleep. I sharpened words like blades. The broadcast was scheduled for prime time. The host introduced me as a whistleblower, a former archivist turned hunter of corporate crime. I stared into the lens and let the world see me. My voice did not tremble. My name is Elena Cross, I said, and I am not here to tell you what might be true. I am here to show you what is. Page after page, evidence unfolded. Contracts. Bank transfers. Fake charities. Politicians on payroll. Children's hospitals built with blood money that had quietly collapsed because safety was cut. I did not summarize. I read. I showed. I accused with paper in hand, eyes fixed on the lens so the millions watching would know the ledger was not rumor, it was scripture of corruption. Kalen responded as expected, with fury. He called it lies, claimed forgery, filed injunctions. But the copies were everywhere by then. Malik had uploaded full scans to servers in half a dozen countries. Rosa had given testimony to families, June to regulators. Every denial Kalen spoke was cut down by another revelation. His empire was bleeding from every corner, and the vultures he once fed with contracts now circled him for scraps. The retaliation grew brutal. They hacked our networks, doxed my allies, painted us as criminals. One night, a car followed me for blocks, and I knew they were deciding whether to strike. But something in me had shifted. I was no longer hiding. I slowed, pulled into a public square under cameras, and stepped out. I stared into the tinted glass of that car until it pulled away. They could threaten my life, but they could not buy my silence. Not anymore. The turning point came when a minor official, one whose name had been a footnote in the ledger, broke ranks. He confessed publicly, weeping, begging for protection. His testimony unlocked the rest. One man cracks, another follows. Soon the foundation at the heart of it all looked less like charity and more like organized crime. Parliamentary hearings turned into criminal trials. Bank accounts froze. Investigations widened across borders. What had begun as whispers at an auction became a storm governments could no longer ignore. And Kalen? He fell not in a blaze of bullets or some cinematic duel. He fell in a hearing room, sweating under the lights, lawyers whispering uselessly at his side. The man who once raised a glass above my brother's grave now stammered as the world watched him squirm. That was justice, not revenge. Revenge is small and private. Justice is humiliation played on repeat in every news cycle until a name is ruined. But there is a cost. Malik disappeared from the grid for months, hunted by men who wanted to erase his trail. Rosa's family fled, starting over with new names in a new city. June's health broke under the pressure of endless nights. And me, I became a ghost with a face the world now recognized. Some called me hero. Others traitor. Both words weigh heavy. Both words can crush. I sit now, pen in hand, writing the last of this confession. The ledger lies beside me, no longer a secret, no longer mine alone. Its pages live in the world, duplicated 1,000 times, beyond burning. My brother's name is still not in it, but every page is soaked in the reason I began. He once told me that silence makes accomplices of us all. So I became noise, and I will remain noise until the end. Do I regret it? That depends on what you think regret means. My life as I knew it is gone. Peace is gone. But the world is different. The empire that believed itself untouchable is broken. Families who thought they were forgotten now speak. A monster sits behind bars, and though prison walls cannot erase what he has done, they stand as proof that power can crack. This is my last confession. I am Elena Cross, and I chose noise over silence. I chose scars over obedience. And if the cost was my peace, then so be it. Because sometimes, to end an empire, you do not whisper. You scream.